Okay. It's on now. All right. All right. Well, welcome. And I think most of you know me. I know most of you. And so that's two-sided. Our program tonight is click. The clicker doesn't work. If we were talking to the moon, it would work. So we're going to talk about Netherlands, England, New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Amsterdam, New York, Delaware, New Jersey. So it's a long trip. And this is actually part one of a two-part set. If you were living here at Landis Homes about 8 years ago, you could have attended this same program. I don't know if that applies to anybody or not. You were? Yes. So part two, let me tell you about part two until they get this up there. Part two is a bus tour of Manhattan, 2-hour walking tour of downtown Manhattan, going up and down the streets and pointing out where all the Mennonites lived and telling stories about who they were, what they did, where they came from, and where they went, in most cases. Then go to Brooklyn and point out the oldest Dutch house in Brooklyn. And then to Gravesend, which is at Coney Island, talk about the first female Mennonite pastor in the U.S. Well, was she Mennonite or not? That's a bit of a question. The Dutch officials called her a Mennonite type Anabaptist, so whatever that is. And then the bus will go to Germantown, and we'll talk about, at Germantown, the people who moved from New York City to Germantown, and some reasons why they moved. So now we've got it up here, the whole thing. Mennonites and other Anabaptists, New Amsterdam, New York, and so forth, Rhode Island. So I am assuming that most of you here have a general idea or understanding of Mennonite history and where the Mennonites came from and all that. And as we did, as I was growing up, I thought Mennonites in America began in 1710 in Germantown, or yes, basically, not Germantown, I'm wrong there, the 1680s in Germantown, with William Penn, and then 1710 Lancaster County. I didn't realize that many years earlier there were 2 Mennonite congregations in what is now New York City, and that disappeared. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, why they disappeared. So first of all, I'm going to go through some things of where they came from, how they got started, and so forth. Click. I don't have a clicker. And this will be a quickie. This is a picture of the area of Switzerland where Mennonites came from. That is the Swiss branch. The next click is to say that the Anabaptists were mostly in Central Europe, Switzerland, Germany, France. 1525, the Swiss Brethren in Zurich. And as you know, we're going to soon be having a big celebration of that, the 1525, 1527 events. There were also Anabaptists in Austria, and some groups called Hutterites, and then Netherlands and the Doopsgezinde, I think, something like that, which means baptism-minded people. The Mennonites in Netherlands do not use the name Mennonite officially. Even today, they are the baptism-minded people. And eventually, a leader emerged, Menno Simons, and that's where the word Mennonite came from. There was also the Russian Mennonites who came along later. They're not really Russian, as you know, people who migrated from Holland, Western Germany, to Poland, to Russia, which then later became Ukraine, and so forth. And then we have 1682, when William Penn, a good Quaker man, came to Pennsylvania. So let's look a little more at what was going on in Netherlands. And let me point out, the word ends with an S. It is plural, Netherlands, because it was a merger of several formerly independent districts, or I don't know if they were called states, and they were put together and called the Netherlands. The Spanish people had controlled that part of the world for many years. It was Catholic, and they were very dominant. They suppressed anybody who wasn't a Catholic, and then eventually, in fact, I think it was in 1640s or so, the Spanish were defeated, and the northern part of Spanish Netherlands, the northern part became the Netherlands. The southern part became Catholic, French-speaking Belgium. But we're only dealing with the northern part. And severe persecution. Between the years of 1534 and 1577, there were approximately 2,500 non-Catholics who were hanged or burned or something or another. Severe Catholic persecution against non-Catholics. There were also, at that time, there were Mennonites. There's three kinds of Mennonites. The Waterlanders, you want to guess where they lived? Yes, they lived along the coast. They were the ones who built the famous dikes. There were the Flemish, who were to the south central, and the Frisian, who were the northeast part. By 1581, these three groups represented a fourth of the population of the country. A fourth. Amazing. For being a non-dominant people in social interaction, they grew tremendously. There are two words that describe them. The first is the word connivance. I don't know what language that is for sure, but it means, the dictionary says it means winked at. Does that make sense? Winked at. In other words, you just kind of ignore them. Most of the time you ignore them. And Schulkirchen, which means the hidden church. Because of the fact that the Mennonites were not an approved denomination, they were not permitted to have church houses along the street. they had to be behind other buildings. So go along the street, and here's a doorway, and that leads to the house or the building behind the other buildings, and there was the Mennonite church. Some of them are rather large. I found it rather interesting that the first Mennonite church building in Philadelphia was a Schulkirchen, was behind other churches. Eventually, now we're mixing up years here, but eventually Netherlands became the most tolerant nation in Europe. We're going to go through some other things before that about persecution and so forth and so on, but eventually they became the most tolerant nation in Europe. Next. Because of the trouble that the Mennonites had with worshiping, there are stories of groups gathering on canal boats and going for a jolly ride, which really was a Bible study. That's why the picture there, instead of meeting in the church house. Next. I have a series of slides about the Dutch Mennonites. I only brought the one of baptism, and it's from a book, and it doesn't show very clearly, but the person to be baptized was kneeling at a chair, and the minister was pouring on their head. I think, yeah, that was their type of baptism. Next. Now, we have a challenge here in that I'm not a song leader, and I don't know any of you. Oh, Mr. Miller is sitting back there. Uh-oh. I was thinking that it might be nice if we could sing this song quickly. Well, as long as it takes. Because it illustrates a very, very fascinating thing that happened. Do you remember I said that the Catholics lost control of the Netherlands and went to Belgium? And so the Reformed people who remained sang this song. I think we'll just read it. This is what they sang on a Sunday morning, but let me go on. And then it was not however many years later until there was freedom to worship for the Mennonites. And even before they had freedom to worship, they also sang the song. So you could have had the Catholic Church, the Reformed Church on one side of the street singing this at the same time that the Mennonites were on the other side of the street singing the same song. But the Reformed were praising God that the Catholics were gone, and the Mennonites were praising God that the Reformed had got their thumbs off of them. So take note of what it says. Do you think we could sing this? Do we know it, don't we? Let's sing it. Together to ask the Lord's blessing, He traces and hastes His will to make known. The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. Sing praises to His name, that's not His own. Beside us to guide us up, God with us joining, ordaining in His kingdom beyond. So from the beginning, the fight we are winning, the Lord side, all glory be thine. Click. Next. All do extol thee, thou leader triumphant and defender will be. Congregation escape tribulation, thy name be ever praised, O Lord, make us free. Now, when you sing that in the future, I don't know who you're going to praise God that he delivered you from, but at least it had meaning to them at that time in that fashion. The Mennonites, having become a dominant part of the population, also found themselves to be very clever in weaving, and they got involved in the shipping business to the extent that they basically controlled the weaving business, they controlled the shipping industry. And it was very nice for them to control the shipping industry, because when all these streams of refugees came from the south, came up the Rhine, they could just get on Mennonite boats and go to England or wherever. From 1661 to 77, I don't know why I said, oh yes, there was a great deal of activity in the Dutch-German area of converting people to become Quakers. Talk about Quakers a little bit later. Next. Okay, here's the Cloth Makers Guild, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people there. Number one, where do I have this? Number one on the left, oh, I didn't write it down here. Oh, yes, number one on the left was Reformed. Number 2 and 3 were Catholics. And the one up on the back was the man serving the meal. And the second one from the right in was Mennonite. His name was Arnold van der Mai, and the one off on the right was a Remonstrant. This is a painting by Rembrandt, as you can see. Rembrandt was a waterlander. Well, not for sure about that. He may have been a waterlander. He at least was buddy with the waterlanders. There's some thought that his wife may have been a Mennonite. Next, another painting by Rembrandt, with the Mennonite preacher and a widow. Next. Okay. Now, I'm not a theologian. I tried to make this as simple as I could, but it doesn't look very simple, does it? There was this big dispute going on among Mennonites in Holland, Netherlands, and in England, whether or not you're an Arminian or a Calvinian or a Calvinist. The Arminian basically said, salvation is accomplished through the combined efforts of God, who takes the initiative, and man, who responds. Calvinism said, salvation is accomplished by the mighty power of God. The Father chose the people, the Son died for them, the Holy Spirit makes his death effective by bringing them to faith and repentance. So there was this dispute arose of whether or not the Anabaptists, the Mennonites in particular, are going to be followers of Arminian, who is Dutch, or Calvin, who was Swiss. And the difficulty continued all the way to this country and still exists in many ways, many places. Are you Arminian or are you Calvinian? Do you know? And the big question is, does it matter? All right, next. And let's look a little bit about what was going on in England. There were people in England as early as 1509 who called themselves separatists, sometimes Brownists, separatists. They seem to have been influenced by people from Netherlands, people from Germany, who came to England. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. 1509, that was Germany and Switzerland. In 1525, we talked about that. It was it was after that when people went to England for freedom of religion, freedom from persecution. And in 1534, Anabaptism in England was outlawed. It was forbidden. By 1535, the British authorities had either hanged or burned at the stake 19 British citizens and 14 Dutch. Although they were foreigners, they were bringing heresy to England, and so the British officials did away with them. And there could be stories told about who it was and where it was. 1538, 6 more Dutch. 1539, a group of British people went to Netherlands for freedom, and because they were British heretics, the Dutch put them to death. So there was no freedom on either side of the water. You could go to the Netherlands and hope. You could go to England and hope, and it didn't matter whether you were British or Dutch. You ran a risk of either being hanged or whatever. 1540, Jean Bowder in England, and I didn't put on here what happened to them. 1555, there were 277 people in England, British people, including a man named John Tooley, who was an interesting character. He was a thief. He admitted he was a thief. He said, no, yeah, I'm a thief. He was also somewhat outspoken against the Pope, but not seriously enough to anybody did anything about it. But because he was a thief, he was hanged. Okay, this is what happens to thieves. And he was buried. And I guess they took his clothes off of him before they buried him. I don't know. But after he was buried, they went through the pockets of his clothing and they discovered he was an Anabaptist. Horrors. An Anabaptist thief, probably the first one on record. And then they said, now we have a problem. Anabaptists are supposed to be burned. So they dug him up and burned him. It's just no limit to what people will do when you are obsessed with whatever. 1575, 27 Dutch people hanged and burned in England, and 2 British. Next. This is a drawing someone did of the burning of Anne Askew in England in 1546. She was either 17 or 19 years of age and would not recant. She was burned. Next. By the way, if I'm not clear, well, totally clear, raise your hand. I don't mind. Where are we now? Okay, let's look a little bit at the English Anabaptists. By the way, the English never used the word Mennonite. They said it was Dutch, has nothing to do with them. The British and the Dutch were not getting along too well together politically. You may remember those days or remember of those days. And anyway, the English never used the word Mennonite. They first used the word Anabaptist, but not many liked that word because they said, we are not Anabaptists. We have never been baptized. Whatever they did to us in the Anglican Church when we were babies and did whatever, sprinkling. That's not baptism. We were never baptized. So if we were never baptized, we can't be rebaptized. Makes sense, I guess. All right. Let's talk about two centers of, I call it, Anabaptism in England. The town of Norwich. The leader was John Smith, and was the leader of the group. They were Arminian. They were, Dutch Arminian. They were British Anabaptists following Dutch Arminian Mennonitism. And in 1606, they decided to move to Amsterdam for religious freedom. It didn't work out so well. They were not welcome because politically the two countries were against each other. Didn't work out very well. 1611, they went back to England, except Smith stayed there and became a Dutch Mennonite minister. Next. It says a procession of religious criminals on their way to prison from an old British book. Next. I think there's something happened here. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. This is the next one. One of the leaders of the group in Norwich was a man named Helways. He took the Dutch Schleitheim Confession and rewrote it in English and to make it fit the British situation. It is regarded as the first statement of separation of church and state in the English language. And the group, now in England, have adopted the name General Baptist. They also changed from baptism by pouring to baptism by immersion. I don't know why. I'm sure that I knew that one time, but I don't remember why they changed, but they did. And they called themselves the General Baptists, not the General Mennonites, not the General Anabaptists, but the General Baptists. And they were located in England. Next. Okay, there was another center of Anabaptism at the town of Scrooby, and the leader there was John Robinson. And this group had a lot of difficulties with the authorities, and so they decided that in 1607 they would move to Holland, to southern Holland, down by the Belgium border, down that way. They set out for the port, and they were captured and taken home, taken back. A couple of months later, they tried it again, and they were captured and prevented from going. The third time, they tried it again, and as they got on the boat, the authorities came and arrested all the men and took them to prison and told the women and children, "You can go." So the women and children went. Among the men were two men whose names you need to remember if you don't remember them before. William Bradford and William Brewster were two of the leaders. And this group in England, this group in Netherlands, asked to become formal members of the Mennonite Church. We want to be Mennonites. Yeah, we disagree politically. We disagree about Arminianism and Calvinism, but we want to be Mennonites. And the Mennonites said, "Oh no, we don't trust you. We don't trust you. You're British. We just don't trust you." This went on for year after year after year, and after about 15 years, they said, "Okay, we give up. Our children are learning to be Dutch. We're not Dutch, we're British. Our children are learning to be Dutch. Let's go to England and ask the authorities to send us to Virginia, where we can have freedom of worship. And they did. And the British government said, okay, we thought we were rid of you, but yes, we'll send you to Virginia. And so they did. And they put them on 3 boats. And of course, 2 of them were leaky. You know that story, perhaps. They ended up all on one boat called the Mayflower. So now, were there Mennonites on the Mayflower? No, not really. But there were Anabaptists. There were about 20 of them. I didn't bring it because we don't. I have a list of them, who they were. Anabaptists, Calvinist Anabaptists who were British, whom the British government put on the Mayflower to send them to Virginia. Of course, you know, they never got there. They ended up in what is now Massachusetts. The few who didn't get on the boat stayed in England. Next. But Robinson, their leader, never went back to England. He stayed in Netherlands. And the group that stayed in England took upon themselves the name Particular Baptist Church. Now, they're not just general people, they are particular people. Yes, they were the Particular Baptists. And in 1640, they adopted baptism by immersion also. The leader in England was John Spilsbury, and in the years following following 1620, both general and particular Baptists went to Massachusetts. Next. I think there was a picture missing, but that's all right. The Mayflower, yeah. I don't know how anybody knows what the Mayflower was like. Okay, you can go on to the next one. So they get to Massachusetts, and for the first 10 years, the colony in Massachusetts was controlled by the Calvinist Anabaptists. We call them pilgrims, not Puritans. I was always confused. What was this pilgrim Puritan business? Their first leader was John Carver. Second leader, William Bradford. Third leader, William Brewster. Remember those names? They were 2 of the men who had gone to Holland. It was a Calvinist, Anabaptist, benevolent theocracy. I didn't invent that word, but that's what they were. You might remember that during those first years of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, they had very, very good relationships with the Indians. And the reason was, I'll say this carefully, the reason was that having come out of being a persecuted people for decades, it was not within their purview to be persecutors of somebody else. One way of saying it. They developed very good relationships, but they had a thorn in the flesh, kind of. His name was Miles Standish. And of course, you know, I read some things online about what a wonderful person Miles Standish was, because how he defended the people from the Indians. But that was coming up. I'm getting ahead of myself. The first 10 years were a benevolent theocracy. 3 of the people that were in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims, although they were not Pilgrims, was Deborah Moody, Ann Hutchinson, and Roger Williams. You'll find I just put them there because you'll find their names later. Next. In 1630, the Puritans began arriving. They were Reformed Anglicans. And they set up a theocracy where the governor and the church leader is the same person, and they began a rather wholesale persecution of anybody who wasn't a Puritan, including the Pilgrims, and in a special way, the Quakers. They were not at all hesitant to decapitate, hang, burn Quakers who showed up. There were Anabaptists, there were Baptists, there were Quakers, but they were not tolerated, and they were expelled from Plymouth Colony. Many of them ended up at Lynn, the town of Lynn, which is still in Massachusetts, and at two other places, another town called Salem, another town called Swansea. I don't know where, they're all Massachusetts towns. And I guess the Puritans thought they were getting rid of them. Next. So what happened? Well, the Baptists, moved to Rhode Island. Roger Williams was elected as their leader. He immediately resigned, said, I am not a Mennonite, I'm not a Baptist, I'm not an Anabaptist, I'm a believer. No labels of any kind. And I'm not a member of any official anything. He knew the language of one or more Indian groups and was a mediator with the Indians. The church that was established in Rhode Island was a Calvinist church, and all were required to bear arms for defense against the Indians. The Quakers, who went along with the group, didn't like this, and they didn't stay very long. They immediately moved to New England, or to New Netherland. Netherland, no S. Took me a long time to sort that out. All right. Next. Okay, other Anabaptists or separatists, 1631. John Throckmorton, who was an Arminian, meaning he was a Mennonite type Anabaptist. Anne Hutchinson with her 15 children. She was a Puritan. And Deborah Moody, those three left Rhode Island and moved to Connecticut with some other people, including Edward Hart, Michael Milner, William Thorne Sr. and Jr. We'll find them later. Next. Oh, by the way, before we do the next, Anne Hutchinson, expelled from Boston, expelled from Massachusetts, and there is a monument of her in Boston. A monument sheltering a child. Someone some years later said, this woman deserves respect. And they did that. Good for them, I guess. Next. All right, now let's change gears. The Dutch. While all this was going on in New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so on, the Dutch arrive in Manhattan. Next. Oops, I didn't know that was in there. Oh, yeah. 1609, Henry Hudson explored the bay and the river. 1623, the first settlement on Manhattan by the Huguenots. And then they moved to the North and South Rivers. North River was in Connecticut. South River was the Delaware. Now, an interesting thing here. The settlement in Manhattan, which became known as New Amsterdam, was the Dutch West Indies Company. not the Dutch government. This was not a government activity. This was not the government of Netherlands sending people to settle in Manhattan. It was the Dutch West Indies Company, and their intent was to make money. It was not to convert people. It was not to claim the territory for the Dutch government, and so on and so on. It was to make money, to pay the people who owned the company. It was administered by the company, not the government. And the settlers were free to pursue business, not freedom, although freedom was a part of it. Next. Whoops. I'm getting my pages out of order here. Next. I didn't know I had that one in. Okay. How did that happen? Well, along with the Dutch West Indies Company came the Dutch Reformed Church. And they sent a person called a dominee, in other words, a minister, to enforce church law, and he forbid any other religion to be practiced in New Netherland, New Amsterdam. No other religion is permitted. The only religion permitted is the Anglican. Is the Reformed, because he was Dutch, is the Reformed. And that was the religious part. The government and the church developed very cruel relationships with the Indians and with the slaves. They brought black people and developed a very antagonistic relationship between the two. Church and state disputes got so intense that the leaders of the Dutch West Indies Trading Company in Amsterdam sent word saying to Kieft, who was the governor, Bogardist, who was the minister, you two are preventing the colony from, or the business from developing. We're recalling both of you. We're going to replace you. And lo and behold, they happened to be on the same boat going back to New Amsterdam. The boat hit a storm off the coast of England and sank. So they never did get back. And during this time, New Amsterdam became a haven for New England religious refugees, primarily British people, who, although there was no religious freedom, technically no religious freedom, when Kieft and Bogardus were gone, British people from New England started coming in. Next. Okay, well, there's Bogardus preaching one Sunday morning. Next. I said they were cruel. There's stories, Dutch soldiers went across the river to New Jersey. They fathered children with the Indian women. And one day, the chiefs in New Jersey brought a boat of these children over, said, these are your children. You must take care of them. So what did they do? They took their axes and cut their arms off. Where they were hanging onto the boat, they cut their arms off, they fell in the water and drowned. Yes, I'm not making this up. Next. There is great. Oh, and the slaves, anything happened, in the city, all you needed to do to say, well, that black man did it. One day they hanged 17, sorry, I'm wrong. They burned 17 black men for something which other people knew was false. Next. Just a recount of the religions that were permitted in New Amsterdam, New England. 1620, of course, was Reformed. 1663, Lutherans were permitted. 1664, Anglican, and that's when it went from New Amsterdam to New York. 1685, the Jewish. 1706, Presbyterian. 1709, First Anabaptists. Next. So, okay. After 1643, when Kieft and Bogardus were gone, Deborah Moody moved from Connecticut and Rhode Island to Hopton or Oyster Bay, not sure which place, and then to Gravesend. Anne Hutchinson moved to Pelham Bay. John Throckmorton moved to Throgs Neck. And Jonas Brunk moved to the Bronx. That's where the Bronx got its name. Deborah Moody, Anne Hutchinson was a Puritan. Deborah Moody was a separatist. John Throckmorton was a Arminian Baptist. Jonas Brunk was Lutheran, and he was not a Mennonite. And in spite of what some people, if dear Mennonite friends, have said, Jonas Brunk was not a Mennonite. Next. It's hard to tell here, but the down on the tip, you see Manhattan way down on the tip. That's New Amsterdam. And then all these spots way up at the top was Hutchinson. Down a little further was Deborah Moody. Over here was the Quaker settlement. And down, all the way down at Coney Island was Deborah Moody. So one day the Indians showed up way up there at the top and wiped out, killed Anne Hutchinson and 14 of her children in retaliation for what the Dutch had done to their children, that is, the Dutch Indian children. They wiped out Anne Hutchinson, 13 or 14. One 8-year-old girl was all that remained. They came down along. They got to Jonas Brunk. They killed him, not his wife and children. They headed on down. They were going to go down here to Coney Island to get Deborah Moody. Now remember, she was this Mennonite-type Anabaptist minister. She rallied her friends, and they got on their horses with their weapons. Good Mennonite minister, a female minister. And they headed to meet the Indians. And when the Indians saw them coming, they said, "We're going home." And they went back to New Jersey. And yeah, next. So there is New Amsterdam. The line up and down is the wall that was built to keep out the British from New England, whom the Dutch were afraid were going to come and overrun them, and to keep out the Indians. Today it is called Wall Street. That's, okay, Wall Street. That was the wall. Next. The last Saturday of August, we're going to do part 2 of this program, which is a walking tour. The red line, we're going to start down here and follow that red line all the way up to over here on the right, talking about where the Mennonites were located. Now, next. Not sure. All right, what happened to these people? Well, Lady Moody went to Gravesend. She was given a piece of land. She designed a town. She assigned the lots. She assumed the leadership of the group, both political and spiritual. It was the first patent or deed written in the Dutch area in the English language, and the first grant of land to a woman. Most of the settlers were British who came from New England, but later some of the Dutch from New Amsterdam also went out there. Next. Gravesend town was placed under Amsterdam, England. It was a colony of Amsterdam, England, not New Amsterdam. They were not permitted to have any religious affiliations, but they met in her house. And she was called by the authorities in New Amsterdam a Mennonite-type Anabaptist, an antinomian, you know what that means, someone who does not respect authority, an erring spirit, a Quaker, a dangerous woman, and an anti-pedo Baptist, which meant someone who was against infant baptism. Next. That was her town plan. I was looking for somebody. Back there she is. Is from, her ancestors are, wave your hand. Her ancestors are from Gravesend.
They came in 1651.
Yeah. And next. Okay. 1645, a group moved from Gravesend to Vlissingen, I don't know how to pronounce it, which the British called Flushing. 1658, they were fined for harboring Quakers, and they prepared something called the Flushing Remonstrance, which was a protest against the administration in New Amsterdam, signed by 31 of the settlers, including including some of the Moody group from England and New England. Next. Now, that's just a copy of the Remonstrance. Next. Now, so I'm done with that part. This is just aside from that. These are the names of Mennonites from London who went to New York and some of them to Pennsylvania. What were Mennonites doing in London? In 1709, there was a big drought in Europe. It was cold. It was, crops didn't grow, and people by the thousands were impoverished, and many, many of the Mennonites went to Netherlands and came to this country, 1710 immigration to Lancaster County. But the government of England said, if you German people come to London, I will send you to New York to work for the British government. So these people went to New York City, from London to New York City. These were Mennonites. Next. Okay. What happened to the Mennonites? Well, number one, there were never a lot of them. Number two, they were the quiet in the town. They never had a central religious leader. They never had, not until 1709 did they have permission to meet. They were not persecuted, but they were tolerated, but it never grew very much. Because they never had a minister, there was no one to baptize their children, so the children were baptized in the Reformed Church and then stayed there. And over the period of years, they assimilated with the Baptists and the Quakers. Many moved away, and by 1740, there were no more Mennonites in New York, or New York, what is currently New York City, until many years later. So that could be the end, but I'm going to add 2 or 3 minutes. These are Mennonites from London who went to New York State. Now, I have this kind of mixed up here. These were people who were Mennonites from Europe and Netherlands who went to New York State, up the Hudson River, because the British government said, we will take you there. Why did they do this? They wanted them to tap pine trees to make pitch so that the British government could develop a big navy. Well, And so they sent them to New York City, or to New York. They outfitted them, and they sent them up the Hudson River. These were Mennonites among the group. There were somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 German-speaking people sent up the Hudson River and across New York State. Next. Let me finish that. It didn't work. They discovered that the pine trees in the Hudson Valley were not the kind that make pitch for boats. Those trees come from North Carolina. And so what happened? They had somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 German-speaking people in the Hudson Valley whom the government said, hasta mañana, see you later. They abandoned them. Some of the German-speaking people who were up in New York State came down the Susquehanna and formed the nucleus of the German culture in what is now Berks County. Those are not, yeah, that's how all that German stuff, that didn't come through here. That came down from up there. All right, Delaware. 1631, a group of Huguenots from Belgium settled at Zwannendale, which meant the Valley of the Swans, which is now Lewis, Delaware. There was an Indian attack, long story, which we won't, and most of the group was wiped out. In 1663, Peter Cornelius Placoy, who was a Dutch, sometimes called Mennonite, sometimes not, he developed the perfect government format. And he went to the government and said, this is how you should organize the government. It will be a perfect whatever. And they said, no, thank you. So he went to England, and he went to the Queen or the King or whoever and presented to them, and they said, no, we're not interested. But in order to get rid of you, we'll send you to Delaware. So he sent them, in 1663, they went to Delaware and took over the fort that had been built by the Huguenots. Well, they were not there a whole year until you had the British conquering the Dutch in New Amsterdam, and then they proceeded to wipe out all the Dutch settlements in the Delaware River. They killed virtually everybody in this settlement too. But some years later, Cornelius Placoy, son of Peter Cornelius, showed up in New York City with his he was blind by that time, showed up in New York City, joined the Reformed Church, but they didn't go so good, so he walked to Philadelphia. That's part of the story when we do the bus trip. Next. Okay, these are people then who moved to and from Delaware. I have there Cornelius Placoy and his wife. Mrs. Peter Cornelius Placoy was not killed in the raid and married Willem Clausen, who was the butcher from New Amsterdam. Next. I think we're about finished. Oh, one more. 1679, two Dutch missionaries, Dankers and Slider, arrived in New Amsterdam, no, by that time it was New York City, and said, we're looking for a place, a utopian community. And they were given a piece of land on the Elk River along the Chesapeake and called it New Bohemia. Augustine and Ephraim Herman were the owners of the land originally. If you go down that way, you might see it's the Augustine Herman Highway. James Hubbard, Peter Bayard, Jacob Van Bibber were all part of the settlement. They came from Gravesend with Deborah Moody. Conrad Beisel was a part of it. Beisel said, no, this isn't working, I'm leaving. He came to Leola, lived in a cave. He didn't like that. He went to Ephrata. Next. I think we're getting, okay, there were some people moved from Gravesend to Middletown. And I think we still soon have the next being the last one. Next one is, yes, the end. Okay, now, I think that maybe it was confusing to you, but very briefly, one of the reasons this was put together was to tell the story of how and why the Mennonites settled in Montgomery County and in Germantown and in Montgomery County. What I didn't tell you here is all of the people from New York who went to Germantown. When the British took over what was New Amsterdam, changed its name to New York, many of the Dutch people became disillusioned with the government and with everything along with it, and began finding ways to move out. And within a few years, many of the Dutch moved away. And when, it's ironic, when Germantown was settled, which by the way was not, was a lot of Dutch people settled there, many of the Dutch from New York settled in Germantown, although they were not German, and although they were not Dutch. Although they were not, what am I saying? Anyway, they helped to settle Germantown. All right. We might have time for a few. If you want to leave, that's fine. You don't. It's okay. Oh, can you hear? I keep walking around. Anyway, do you have any questions, any clarifications that I can answer briefly from here? No. Good. All right. Now, the last I heard, there's still room on the bus. August 31, the bus leaves here at 6:30 in the morning, gets back at 7 or 8 in the evening. It's a bus, it is sponsored by the Mennonite Heritage Center of Harleysville. This is part 1. They're doing part 2. This is recorded tonight, and they will have the option of watching it on YouTube, if they wish, before the bus goes.
How do we find it on YouTube? What do we put in?
How can you get it on YouTube? There's a fine young lady around here whose name is Janice Hess. She will know that.
Daniel,
Yes.
do a search for Landis Homes. That's all you have to put in, Landis Homes. And then there will be several. It's a one-day trip. Ones you can choose.
Okay, so go to latest sons, I can find it.
Okay. All right. You are dismissed. Thank you. Thank you. Am I still on? Yeah. The Pennsylvania Mennonite Heritage Magazine, July 2011, has this story. This story plus the New Amsterdam, New York story, if anybody's interested.